Greetings and welcome to the another episode of Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. Let's dive in. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Andrew Likierman, Professor of Management Practice at the London Business School, whose pioneering work on leadership judgment is shaping both academic thinking and business practice. Educated at the University of Vienna and Balliol College, Oxford, Professor Andrew's current research has culminated in his latest book, Judgement at Work, Making Better Choices. With a distinguished career spanning academia and public service and the private sector, Professor Andrew has held leadership roles at the UK Treasury, Bank of England, and several major corporations, including Barclays and Beazley. A past president of the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, he brings decades of experience in both strategic decision-making and corporate accountability. In the field of corporate governance, he served on the influential UK Cadbury Committee and was part of the UN Governance Steering Committee established by Secretary-General Kofi Annan. Professor Andrew was honored with the Sunday Times Award for Non-Executive Director of the Year in the public and non-profit sector. In this episode, Professor Andrew Likierman shares key insights from his acclaimed book, Judgement at Work, Making Better Choices, offering practical wisdom on decision-making in leadership. So without further delay, let's welcome Professor Andrew Likierman to the podcast. Professor Andrew, it's an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me.
Professor, let's start with the basics. Why is good judgment so central to leadership and business success? And what inspired you to write this book now?
Well, let me take the second question first about what inspired me to do it, because that explains, I hope, much more about why it's so important. As you said, I've worked both in academia, but also very much I've had experience in the private sector and in public service. And in all these areas, and particularly in leadership roles, it seems to me that judgment has been a very important element in determining how successful a leader was. And therefore, I thought to myself, it's a really interesting thing here. Why is there almost nothing written about judgment? Can I do something somehow to fill this gap? And so this is why I've done the work on judgment over the last few years, and this is why I wrote this book. In particular, if one thinks about the question to answer the first part, why is it important? It seems to me that if you look at a leader with judgment, this is someone who others who deal with the leader can rely on to look at choices and make a choice that is in the best interests of the organization. A leader without judgment is someone who is, quite frankly, could be a nightmare in terms of being unpredictable, you don't know why they're doing things, and so on. So it seems to me it's an important element of the leadership process. Can I just say another thing too, because in relation to maybe people on the call here who are professionals, and if you look at professionals, one of the things that characterizes a good professional is someone who exercises professional judgment. And that's another reason why I've focused on judgment in relation to professions.
Very insightful. Professor, you have developed a 6-part framework for improving judgment. Could you walk us through these components and how they interrelate?
So I'll take you through the 6, and I'm well aware of the fact that 6 is a large number. I prefer it to be 3 or 2 so that everybody could remember it.
Sure.
So forgive me if it's 6, but the trouble is this is a little bit complicated concept, and therefore simply saying, well, we can do it very, very straightforwardly. Alas, it's got to be a little bit more nuanced in order to cover the area. All right, so let me take you through the 6 elements. The first one is the relevant knowledge and experience which you bring to a particular choice. And I say relevant because one may have a lot of knowledge and experience. What matters is, can you apply it to this particular choice? So relevant knowledge and experience is number 1. Number 2 is awareness. Awareness of what's happening in the particular situation in which you find yourself. A delicate situation, perhaps, involving people. Are you aware of what's going on? You may think, for example, of a meeting. in a meeting, the dynamics of the meeting can change quite rapidly. In order to make a good judgment, it's important to know what's going on in that meeting. So awareness is number 2. Number 3 is trust. Trust in the people you deal with and in the information you get. We all have to get information in order to make judgments. And the question is, what quality is that information? If it's people who we can't trust, if it's information we can't trust, then the judgment, bluntly, is at risk. So number 3 is trust. Number 4 is the feelings and beliefs that we have, and these filter the information which we get in. We feel strongly about something, we feel less strongly about it. This is an important element in the way in which we approach the judgment process. This includes our emotions, for example. We may be angry, we may be afraid. All these things have got to be taken into account in the quality of judgment. Number 5 is the way we make the choice. And you can think of people making choices, very carefully and people making them less carefully. And what matters here is what is the quality of the process where we make the choice. Now, I'm not saying all choices have to be slow in order to be good, because sometimes you've got to take a decision quickly. You haven't got much time. If you don't do something right now, things can go badly wrong. So the question of the quality of choice is not just how much time, but also what is relevant to this situation. Finally, there's the question of delivery. What is the opportunity we have for actually delivering what we decide? We may decide to do some brilliant things and then not do them. In that case, that wasn't a good judgment. So delivery, finally, is the 6th element of the process. So there you are. I'm sorry it's, as I said, it's so many, but I mean, it seems to me that any of these, just to be clear, is better than none of them. So if you do something to establish how much you can trust information, if you do something on the process of choice, it's better than nothing. It doesn't have to be all 6.
One of the most fascinating aspects of your book is the focus on recognizing judgment in others. How can managers reliably assess the judgment of potential hires or team members?
Look, we work with people inevitably in life. I mean, even though we may work on our own as a sole practitioner, as somebody who is an independent contractor, we still have to work with others in order to get things done. You simply cannot sit there doing things entirely on your own. So in terms of recognizing whether other people have got judgment, going back to my framework, which I've just given you now, you need to look at the question of, all right, so what evidence do I have that this person has got good judgment? Can I trust this person? Are they aware of what's going on? Are they knowledgeable about the relevant thing we're doing now? How well do they make their choices? How far are they driven by their feelings and beliefs, perhaps irrationally? And how far do they think carefully about what they do? If they promise something, can they deliver it? So it's the reverse of what I've just described in looking at how other people operate.
In today's fast-moving and uncertain environment, how do you balance intuition with evidence-based analysis when making high-stakes decisions?
Well, I think there's no incompatibility between the idea that you look for evidence, you look for signs that things are going well and so on. I mean, you can do that even if you have to make a choice in seconds, frankly. You have to make a very quick appraisal of the situation, get the data that you need right now. I mean, think about if somebody asks you an awkward question. You may think, all right, well, you can't hesitate in responding, you need to respond. But your response needs also perhaps to take into account the fact you may not want to commit yourself immediately to something. You may want to say, well, I want to go and think about that. Or if you have to make a choice, then you might say, I am making a choice very quickly here. I recognize that. So it's about the question of saying the speed is not incompatible with good judgment. What good judgment indicates is that speed, the reasons for speed have to be taken into account, and that has also to be communicated, if necessary, to the people with whom you're dealing.
Professor, can you share an example either from your own experience or research where poor judgment led to significant consequences and what we can learn from it?
Well, sadly, the world is full of poor judgment and the results of poor judgment. If one looks at companies that have gone badly wrong, the signs of good judgment poor judgment all over that. You know, I read a book recently about Credit Suisse, the big Swiss bank, big international Swiss bank, which was highly regarded not long ago and effectively went bust. It went bust because of a number of very poor choices made by its management over a period of time, which led it to disaster. I mean, in any country where one goes, and if a number of your people on this podcast are in India, you will know very well from Indian case where people have gone badly wrong, just how bad judgment can end in trouble. And similarly, people have rescued companies in trouble, organizations in trouble, through good judgment. And that too provides some very inspiring stories.
Professor, you mentioned that judgment can be improved. What are some practical steps individuals and organizations can take to develop better judgment over time?
Well, what I've done in my book, and I hesitate to refer people to that because this podcast should stand on its own. You know, I've got a list of 100 things or more you can do to. In fact, the whole book is about how you can improve your judgment. But if one looks at, any of the 6 things which I mentioned in my framework, the main thing, first of all, is to identify for yourself where your main areas for possible improvement are. So, for example, let's say you go into a new field. So the problem is you don't have relevant knowledge and experience. So there the question is, all right, so how do I improve my knowledge and experience for this? And for example, one may want to go and get experience working in a new field or in a new part of the organization that becomes relevant then. Let's say you take on new responsibilities. You may want to talk to a lot of people who are knowledgeable about that particular field to fill the gaps. You may want to ask, for example, to a secondment, if you're able to a particular part of the organization in order to gain more experience of that part of the organization. Now, that just kind of illustrates in terms of knowledge and experience the kind of approach one can take. In the case of feelings and beliefs, this is very different because here what one has to do is to be aware of the emotions one has, aware of the feelings one has, in order to take those into account when you make difficult choices. So, for example, let's say you have a tendency to be over-optimistic. So there what you can do, if you know you have a tendency to be over-optimistic, you can have people to come and work with you who give a balance, who counsel caution when you're always being over-optimistic, so you can achieve a balance. You can also, of course, change yourself to say, all right, I won't immediately assume everything is going to go perfectly. I will understand that things can go wrong and build in contingencies, and then learn about how to build in contingencies. So here, what one's doing, again, is identifying a weakness and taking the relevant steps to address that weakness. Now, there are, anybody listening to this has their own very particular situations, and so any generalizations I give may not be relevant to them. You've got to pick out what's good for you in particular situations and address it through that.
How do cultural differences, industry norms, or organizational dynamics influence what we perceive as a good judgment?
Well, one of the things I was very careful about was the question of whether what I was doing was culturally specific based on my own experience and my own culture and the way that I operate. Now, fortunately, the London Business School is a place which is incredibly international. We have people from more than 100 countries here at any one time, and there are very many cultures represented all the time here. So I'm used to lecturing in an environment which is multicultural and where you cannot assume your own personal norms are involved. Now, I say that because I approach this on the understanding that I could not assume that what was okay for me would be okay in any other culture. And I took a lot of trouble. I went, for example, to Japan and to China in order to establish that as these two very different cultures, would judgment apply in these cultures? And I talked to a lot of people there to try and establish that. Now, they told me that it would apply. And so I'm reasonably confident in that respect. I came to India, I went to Singapore, I went to all over, many different areas, Latin America, and so on, to talk to people of very different backgrounds to me. Now, how one applies this, therefore, again, has to be specific to a context. But that is also true within a culture. If you go, in some cases, let us take the United States, if you go to California, people are not interested in anything but the future, hypothetically, in Silicon Valley, all right? If you go to the Midwest, they are pretty conservative. So even within the same culture, there's going to be a lot of difference. So I don't think that culture is, it makes the framework different. How one applies it is going to be different within any culture.
Professor, many leaders today operate in high-pressure, information-saturated environments.
Yeah.
What role does discernment play in filtering out noise to make sound decisions?
Well, look, noise, there's always noise. We have many distractions. We have many influences. We have many people telling us contradictory things. The world is full of confusing information. And one element of good judgment is very much about the question of how you address this issue of all this noise, all this confusion, understanding that you can't take things very often at face value, and you need to probe, if necessary, to find out where the truth is, underneath all that noise and all that confusion. Now, you may not be able to do it. And if so, and if you have doubts, your judgment also ought to be influenced by the fact that you don't necessarily know all the things you would like to know. So that is a very important element in good judgment, because, understanding the limitations of what one's doing and communicating those where necessary, for example, making forecasts, is the way in which good judgment is exercised.
Professor, my last question. If there is a one takeaway you hope readers and our listeners remember from your book, what would that be?
Well, look, my suggestion would be that you may not have taken the idea of judgment seriously before. You may have regarded it, well, we don't know what it is exactly. It's sort of very difficult to define. We're not sure about it. So I believe that this is something which is a process, that you can learn to do it better, and that considering how important many of the choices we make in life are, I believe that spending time improving one's judgment is time very well spent.
Listeners, that brings us to the end of this insightful episode. It has been a true privilege to speak with Professor Andrew Likierman, whose pioneering work continues to shape how leaders think about judgment, decision-making, and organizational effectiveness. Drawing from a distinguished career across academia, public service, and the private sector, Professor Likierman's wisdom reflected in his book Judgment at Work Making Better Choices offers a timely and practical framework for improving how we lead, choose, and evaluate. Professor Andrew, thank you for sharing your time and insight with us. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and as always, make better choices. Thank you so much, Professor Andrew.